Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics 2012 Post-Election Conference. I'm Bill Lacey, the director of the Institute. We're delighted that you could all join us today. It looks like we have a virtually completely full house. Those of you who are here seated with us in this room are lucky because there's at least, at the last time I looked, another 30 or 40 people sitting outside watching on closed circuit TV. So thank you all for your support. This is one of my favorite programs that we do every 2 years, and we're delighted that you can be here with us. I would take the kind of start out today and make a few announcements. Please, if you have a cell phone, please turn it off. Today's session and tomorrow morning's session will be completely on the record. Our associate director that many of you know, Barbara Ballard, serves as the president of the National Black Caucus of State Legislators, and her conference is today and tomorrow. So she will not be with us, so if you wonder where Barbara is, she is representing the Dole Institute and KU in a very prominent way. In addition to having a number of KU faculty and students in attendance, I'm pleased to announce that the following campuses are represented by faculty or students: Fort Hays State, UMKC, Pittsburgh State, Rockhurst, Wichita State, Emporia State, and Benedictine College. So welcome to all of you. We also have past attendees from our annual Civics and History Teachers Symposium and Dole Scholars in attendance today. We'll take a break during the first session, which will run from 3 to 6:30 at approximately 4:30 to 5 p.m. Would ask for your help in getting our panelists in and out quickly. So we ask you, I know you want to grab them and talk to them and meet them all and ask them a lot of questions. Well, our format won't allow for that, so we ask for your cooperation with that. And we'll have a quick turnaround. We'll be doing a dinner with our Friends of the Dole Institute group tonight, which is our donor group, at 6:30. So as soon as this session concludes, if you're a friend and you're coming to the dinner, stick around and we'll get the panelists in and get started as quickly as we possibly can. We will do a short Q&A session after each of our two sessions, today and tomorrow. If you want to ask a question, I'll give you a little bit of a heads up. We won't do this the way we normally do with the roving mics because we're too packed in to do that today. But we will have a mic that's stationary in the back of the room near the door, and like I said, you can queue up there and ask questions. We do ask that you ask one brief question and that you do not make statements because I have a very tight timetable and a lot of fascinating people here to hear from, and so this is their chance to talk, but we encourage you to ask any questions that you have. Now I'd like to introduce our 11 panelists. We're excited. We've got a terrific group this year, and we appreciate all of their help. And I'll ask you, after I've introduced all of them, to welcome them to the Dole Institute and KU. First off, to my left, Jeff Zeleny, New York Times; Jeremy Bird, National Field Director for the President's Campaign; Marlon Marshall, Deputy National Field Director for the President's Campaign and KU grad; Brent Colburn, National Communications Director for the President's Campaign; and Erin McPike from RealClearPolitics.com. To my right, Jerry Seib of the Wall Street Journal, also a KU grad. Wow. Katie Packer-Gage, Deputy Campaign Manager for Governor Romney's campaign; Rich Beeson, National Political Director for Governor Romney's campaign; James Hohmann from the political website POLITICO; exit pollster extraordinaire Joe Linsky. Joe, by the way, is the only panelist who has actually attended all four of our post-election conferences, and Jerry has attended one previously. And last but certainly not least, Republican strategist and Dole Fellow Nancy Dwight. Please welcome them to the Dole Institute. We're going to go through a lot of material in a very short period of time, and so we again appreciate all the panelists coming in. I'd like to throw out the first question, and I'll direct it to the Obama campaign first and then the Romney campaign. Would you guys please speak on your side with the Obama campaign to the advantage of not having a nomination fight and maybe if you saw any disadvantage in that, and then I would ask the Romney representatives to do the same thing.
Sure. I'll go first. Thanks, Bill. For us, there were a couple of advantages, and I think certainly some disadvantages, and Brent will talk a little bit about the messaging. But in terms of the way that we looked at it, first is we knew that we had to start early. And so we launched the campaign probably earlier than any presidential campaign has been launched, April of 2011. And we knew that one of the things we wanted to really take advantage of is that time. In politics you have money, people, and time. And this is one of the only times I've worked on a campaign where we had time, and we wanted to make sure that we didn't squander it. So that was, I think, one of our biggest advantages. That what that looks like is we had time to build up our organization. We had time to test staff. We had time to analyze things that were working and things that weren't. We could test how we were doing with voter registration a year out and make adjustments as we got closer to the election day. So I think the number one advantage for us on the organization side, certainly, and really on everything we did, was time. We could make decisions like taking technology in-house because we had time to do it as opposed to just going to vendors. So I think that for me is the biggest advantage. There were some disadvantages to that too on the time frame because it was hard to get our volunteers and people who were paying attention to have a sense of urgency. You call somebody in the summer of 2011, we need your help to reelect the president. They say, yeah, call me back when the campaign's on next year. We asked somebody to give money in early of 2011. They say, great, I'm totally on board. Call me back in 2012. So that was the sort of flip side of the time. And then I think Brent's going to talk more about messaging and
yeah, and this is a slight variation off the question, I guess. The flip side to not having a nomination fight is being the sitting president of the United States. And that comes with both advantages from incumbency, but also with disadvantages. When you're the president, you own everything that happens in the federal government on a daily basis. So in that whole run-up, if it was something the Justice Department was dealing with, like a Fast and Furious, if it was a TSA agent doing something stupid at a checkpoint, if it was something going on in international affairs, that was something that we didn't just have to deal with the messaging of presenting the president's vision for the country. We had to work very hand in glove with our partners at the White House to make sure that the campaign was reflecting what the White House was saying and doing in terms of messaging around the events of the day, but also making sure that we were looking at that through the context of getting the president reelected. So that in times was a bit of a challenge, the one that I think every incumbent faces. And I would just say from a messaging standpoint on the advantage side, in terms of the candidate as a messenger, and I'm sure the Romney folks would agree with this, is that there is a certain battle testing that takes place during the primary process. If you look back at 2007, 2008, Barack Obama was a different candidate when he started in Iowa than he was when he was elected president. He was a sharper candidate. And it's a change in gears. It's a different posture to be the sitting president, doing the job of president, and be the sitting president as the campaigner. And he obviously had an adjustment period with that. And I think that, in the end, got back to a really sharp fighting form. But that's something that you don't have the natural mechanism of the primaries and caucuses to kind of force the candidate within the person to come out. So.
Okay. Let's go over to Katie and Rich. Advantages and disadvantages from the primaries that you guys faced?
Well, certainly, to Brent's point, there's an advantage in terms of the battle testing, and I think we saw that evidenced in the first general election primary, that Governor Romney, having gone through over 20 primary debates, was a very, very sharp debater, even though one would argue that those weren't really debates so much as candidate forums. But certainly there wasn't a question that he had not been asked on a stage, with the national media covering it. That said, obviously the $87 million that our campaign had to spend in order to win the primary would have been very useful in the general election. And that was something that we had to sort of start fresh with when the general election started. And certainly the Obama campaign was sort of banking on the fact that Mitt Romney was going to be the nominee and was not waiting for Rick Santorum to drop out in order to start sort of launching salvos against our candidate. So, the $100 million or so that was something we were taking on in incoming was something that was certainly not an advantage. All things being equal, you probably would rather not have to go through that, or having maybe a little bit more time between when the primary ends and the general election occurs would be probably a more preferable situation. But it is what it is, and the president had to go through that 4 years ago, and that's what the process, brought us, and so that's the game you play.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Jeremy said, in the Bush campaign in 2004, we were opening offices in November of 2003, and we thought that we had a pretty good head start. So, April of the year prior is even a bigger head start. We opened up our first victory offices in June of 2012. So functionally and organizationally, didn't have the time and the same amount of time to get things up and running that the other campaign did. But that's part of the game, and that's why it's better to run as an incumbent than as a challenger. And you saw the reality of that. So the primary process was we called it the long slog. It was a long and arduous process of going through with this new proportional system of allocating delegates to get to 1,144 delegates. We had a scenario that went all the way to June 12th in the Utah primary before we went over the top. Now, luckily, that didn't play all the way out, but we knew that it could be a very long process. So, all in all, I think again the debates were that's the one thing that came out of this. I think Governor Romney got to be a very good debater during the primary. That obviously helped us in the general election. But it's very difficult for a challenger to fight a two-front battle, fighting 5 or 6 opponents in a primary and also an incumbent looking towards the general. So all in all, I think on our side, there were probably more disadvantages than advantages, but you played the hand you dealt. So.
Okay. I asked both campaigns to prepare kind of their general election path to victory, and we're going to start with the president's re-election campaign. Gentlemen, you have 10 minutes.
Marlon's going to talk through the states and kind of how we looked at our pathway to 270 electoral votes, and Brent will talk through what our message strategy was throughout the campaign. I'll just give a couple of comments at the beginning, kind of as an overview of what we were thinking in terms of our strategy. The first thing is that we knew we had to make it a choice. That if we were simply running with a voter going to the booth saying, as a referendum on the president, that we were going to be at a severe disadvantage. So we knew from the beginning that it had to be a choice to voters about the difference between the two visions. And if we could make that, we felt like we'd be in a good position. If we weren't able to get to that position, we felt like we were going to be at a disadvantage. So that was the number one thing we thought about kind of as a sort of macro issue. We also believed that in order to get to 270 electoral votes, we had to leave as many pathways open as possible. This is not a national election. National polls are interesting, but they don't really mean much. What matters is what are the polls saying in Colorado? What are they saying in Florida? And if you look at them, your own internals and where you're going, can you add up the electoral votes to get to 270? And so we wanted to keep every single state possible in play and make it look as much like 2008 as possible with those pathways. And then I think the last big thing I want to say at the beginning is our strategy was really about 4 things. It was about building an organization, number one, that could do the last 3 things that I'll talk about. And that meant building a very, very integrated organization that was a modern campaign, knowing that we couldn't have a field program and a digital program. We needed to have an organizing program that had digital components with technology to support it that happened on the ground. So we had to have an organization, and that means we had to have the money. We had to have the grassroots piece of it. We had to have the donors. We had to have the volunteers. We had to have the offices for people to work out of. We had to have the technology to back it up. We had to have a press team that could work in all these battleground states. So the number one piece of when we said this is what we have to do is build an organization capable of doing 3 things. Registering the voters we needed to register to expand the electorate, which I'll get back to in a second. Persuading the voters we needed to persuade who we knew were going to turn out, but voted for us in 2008, didn't vote for Democrats in 2010, or who were just otherwise persuadable and undecided. And then the final thing was to increase turnout amongst our key demographic targets, our key supporters who we knew were least likely to vote. And so we built our entire strategy around those 4 components. Building the organization, doing the voter registration we needed to do, persuading the voters we needed to persuade, and then turnout. And we basically made a decision that if you weren't doing one of those 4 things, no matter what you were doing on the campaign, you should stop doing it. And we should stop spending money on it. And that went every piece of the campaign, whether you're in Chicago or in a battleground state or in a state next to a battleground state that was supporting those battleground states. We really tried to evaluate our strategy within those four things. And then Brent's going to talk a little bit more about what message frame we were trying to do to get that choice. And Marlon will talk about our strategy for getting to 270 in those states.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Jeremy. I'm going to talk about kind of three buckets when it comes to communication. First of all, a lot of times I think we get too wrapped up in the message and forget some of the mechanics. So we're going to talk about the message, and that's the choice that Jeremy talked about. A little bit of candidate definition, because there's obviously the message that the candidate is delivering, but elections, particularly presidential elections, are about almost as much about how voters feel about the candidate and their values and kind of the person they will be as a leader. And then third, just a little bit about what I call the boring stuff, but what I really actually like and what I did most of on the campaign, which was some of the structural pieces. So I won't spend too much time on message, because hopefully you know what our message was. It's that we needed to build an economy from the middle out, and that meant investing in things that help the middle class, like education, infrastructure, and tax cuts. And our message in terms of the Romney campaign was that they believed in top-down economic structure, so trickle-down economics. In terms of the candidates themselves, I think you saw that we talked a lot about the president being someone that made tough choices. And you may not agree with him, but you'll always know where he stands. And then finally, on the structure piece, look, we built a very large, very complex, but I think a very effective communications team, investing in a lot of things you might not see, like large booking programs in our state organization. So, for instance, we had 12 people on staff just doing communications in Ohio by Election Day. And that was a team that I would have put up against almost any national campaign in a presidential cycle going back to any presidential campaign that I've been a part of. So it really was about driving talent out to the states, giving them the tools and backup that they need, and focusing on, again, the block and tackle pieces of communication. So making sure we're getting people on the radio in battleground states, making sure that we have consistency between what we're saying on the web, what we're saying in terms of folks on television, what we're saying with our products. And again, messaging is just another tool in a campaign. So it needs to drive towards the goals that Jeremy talked about. So we really did look at, it might be nice to do TV in this market, but we really need to do TV in this market because that's what analytics is telling us is a place we need to spend more time. So that's kind of how we approach things.
And then, excuse me, I also want to talk about how we viewed our state operation. I think it goes back to the first kind of question that you mentioned in terms of we had time, and that time was very beneficial to us in terms of we had staff on the ground for up to 2 years in these states. These staff knew their states. Our Ohio State Director had been there. He's from Ohio. He knew Ohio. He had been working for us, since April 2011. And same with almost all of our states across the country. So when you look at the operation and you want to build it state by state, to Bird's point, and not have it be just a national campaign, but a state campaign, the first piece is investing in your staff, having them understand the lay of the land of each of those states, and be able to understand what they need to do to get to victory. Once we did that, we started a significant planning process. So the 4 buckets Bird talked about, what we need to build an organization, and then we got to build an organization that's going to persuade, register, and then ultimately turn out people. And we looked at each individual state. So how we were going to win Ohio was very different than how we were going to win Virginia, and very different than how we were going to win Colorado. And to be able to have the time to plan and see and look at the data, like Brent mentioned, and see, all right, we need to go register this many voters in a state like Virginia, or persuade this many voters in a state like Ohio. We were able to figure that out early and had a lot of time to be able to execute that plan in each individual state. And then the plan was integrated. So we had great communications teams in there, all of our states, great digital teams, field directors, et cetera. All those folks had the chance to work together for a while. They built a plan together that was around those 4 buckets. So you would have a persuasion plan, and it would have a digital piece, it would have a communications piece, it would have a field piece. All that would be executed through our neighborhood team program on the field side, working with other departments as well too. So to have that time to really get that planning process down, I think was extremely important. And we were able to figure out early on in a state like Florida, we have to change the electorate in Florida in order to be successful. And we spent a year, almost a year and a half, registering voters in Florida in order to keep Florida on the map and ultimately be able to pull that off a couple days later on Election Day.
Yeah, and I would just say one other thing, that it goes back to the original question as well in terms of advantages. One of the advantages that the Obama world has had over the last 5 or 6 years is really the consistency in leadership, and consistency in leadership at every level. If you own a business, just think of the advantage of on day 1 of opening your business, 70% of the people that walk through the door have worked together before. And many of the people that were in leadership last time, including Jeremy, who was in Ohio, I was in Michigan, were people that were in the states last time, so really understood what that state level operation should look like. So, I mean, just from a purely organizational standpoint, that gave us a real, I think, competitive advantage in terms of, even when we needed to bring staff on, we had a very ready pool of staff within the administration and around the country that we could tap and bring in when we needed to, that kind of already knew the program, already knew the language, already knew kind of the internal unspoken rules that any organization has. So that was very helpful.
And one thing to add, I think systems are really important as well too when you have a presidential campaign. And so our HQ staff mirrored our state staff. So I was the one working directly with the field directors, Brent with the communication directors, and so we were all on the same page at HQ, and we would be on the same page in the state, and we had that kind of relationship together to help build a planning process in each individual state to figure out how we were going to get to 270.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll go to the Romney campaign.
I'll let Rich talk in a minute about sort of the tactical path that we had charted state by state, but our path didn't really change all that dramatically from the primary to the general. We felt that our path in the primary, which we knew was going to be a very sort of Southern evangelical, very, very conservative primary process, which was, sort of an uphill challenge for a Mormon governor from Massachusetts who happened to be a multimillionaire. But we felt that our path was to clearly define the president as a president who had failed the American people. Mitt Romney, never said, I think, a harsh personal word about President Obama, but was always very clear that Obama wasn't working. That was a big part of our campaign theme in the primary, whether it was related to, the fact that he presided over 40 straight months of unemployment over 8%, spending that exceeded all of the previous presidents combined, pet project spending on things like Solyndra, that were very clearly failed initiatives that cost the American taxpayer billions and billions of dollars. All of these things were things that we pointed to send the message that Obama wasn't working. And there was a lot of talk in the general election, is this a choice election or is this a referendum? And to a degree, we felt that it was both, that we had to lay the groundwork very early on that this was a referendum on President Obama, and then we had to create a viable alternative in Mitt Romney. So in terms of a message, we felt like we had a guy who, throughout his life and throughout his career, virtually everything he touched, he turned around and improved and left better. And it seemed like a very clear choice to us. Here you had a president who had failed the American people, and here you had a choice of a guy who had, in business, had done well, had created many, many jobs in the private sector. He'd gone on to the Olympics and turned around something that was really on the road to dire failure and something that was about to be a huge humiliation both to Salt Lake City and to the United States as the head of the host committee for the Olympic Games. Then he'd gone on to be governor of Massachusetts and turned things around there. So we felt that the path was to create a referendum on President Obama and then a very clear choice that Mitt Romney was a guy that could turn things around. The advantage that the Obama campaign had in defining Mitt Romney early and maybe not making that choice quite as stark as we would have liked it to be was very clear. And it was, I think, difficult, coming into the general election when we were starting at such a disadvantage financially to sort of redefine Mitt Romney as not the guy with horns and a pitchfork that maybe he had been defined as, and sort of, reintroduce him to the American people was something that I don't think we really got a chance to do until that first debate. I think that was the first time that the American people were able to see who Mitt Romney really was side by side with the president, out of the filter of 30-second television ads and mail pieces and phone calls. But that was the path from a message standpoint. So I'll let Rich talk a little bit about the roadmap.
Well, the first mistake that I made personally was I thought, we had to fight this long slog to get to 1,144 delegates. And so I figured 270 electoral votes would be 3 times as easy. Turns out that wasn't the case at all. And I want to compliment Jeremy and his team and the entire Obama campaign. That even a lot of campaigns have time, but what they were very good at is discipline. And they were very disciplined in what they did. They never wavered off of it. Obviously, both campaigns try to pull campaigns off of their message and off of their tactics, and they were very good at staying on both. The other key is voter registration. You touched on it a little bit. It was one of their 4 tenets. It's something that is incredibly important that a lot of people don't focus on. On our side of things, to give you a specific example, in 2000, we lost New Mexico by 366 votes to Vice President Gore. Over the next 4 years, we registered 52,000 Republicans in New Mexico and won New Mexico by less than 10,000 votes in 2004. So voter registration is an incredibly important aspect, and it's something that they did very well, very targeted, very tactically. So those are 2 points I want to make, complimenting them on that. The other that's changed campaigns moving forward is the combination of the digital and political working together. The Romney campaign was the first Republican presidential campaign to elevate the digital strategies director to a senior level position. So instead of it being an afterthought of saying you're implementing a plan and then you go back and include the digital in it, they were involved in the start, and they were very instrumental in everything that we did, whether it was voter registration, absentee ballot, early vote, GOTV. Our digital team, it's like Jeremy said, it was one operation and tried to make it as seamless as possible. We didn't have as much time, and that'll be a recurring theme we keep coming back to. But for the upstart that we were, I think we did a fairly decent job of getting it up and running and integrating the two. When you talk about the state staffs and 10 communication staff in Ohio, we kept hearing about the size of the Obama team out in these states, and I couldn't figure out what they were doing, all these staff. Now it's become very clear, but I also know how the unemployment rate dropped from 8% to 7.8 in October. But they made very good use of them, so I can't say that. We had we started out with 3 goals. We wanted to win independents. We wanted to turn out low propensity, high support score voters, regardless of their registration, and we needed to make sure our base turned out. Going into Ohio, again, if this was something that Jeremy heard me, Jeremy and I traded memos back and forth a lot, but we always said if we were winning independents in Ohio, you would win Ohio, because that's just the way it always was. Well, again, they were looking at a different dynamic, and their dynamic proved out. We won independents in Ohio, turned out low propensity, high support score, and held the base in Ohio, and we obviously didn't win Ohio. So those were the things we started out with and based our vote goals around and executed throughout the campaign on. Our path was always fairly, they wanted a nice wide path, and ours was always pretty much, at least at the start, it included Florida, North Carolina, Virginia, and Ohio. We had to win those 4, and then you just had to win one of any other state, whether it was New Hampshire, Iowa, Colorado, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, any of those. But our path to 270 was always predicated on those 4 states that we needed to win. Obviously, it was threading the needle. It was a very tight path, but that's part of what you do when you're running against an incumbent president. So we spent a lot of time and effort in those 4 states. I think all of them were close, but that only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. So that's where we executed the bulk of our campaign. It was in those 4 states, and then looking to pick up one of the other ones.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to get the other panelists now to comment on your perceptions of the race at the time that it became a 2-man race. At the time the governor secured the Republican nomination, what were you thinking about this race?
I think one thing that was very clear early on was that the Obama campaign was actually playing in the Republican primary race. I mean, the Obama campaign started to engage long before this became a 2-man race, and it's because they could. It's because they had a lot of money. And so the Romney campaign was actually fighting on several different fronts. Sometimes it was Newt Gingrich for a while, and then it was Rick Santorum. So it was sort of like a game of whack-a-mole. But the other opponent that was always present was the Obama campaign, and with press things and other things. So I think once it became actually Obama versus Romney, I guess probably the first week of April or the second week of April or so, it was very clear that the Obama campaign was intent on defining Governor Romney out of the box immediately. And there was all this hand-wringing among some Democrats like, oh, they're wasting their money, should they be doing this? So I think it's probably pretty clear, and I'm guessing that Rich and Katie would agree, that it was a good use of money to define Governor Romney earlier. And it just reminded me exactly of the 2004 campaign in reverse, when the Bush campaign was intent on defining Senator Kerry from the beginning, and it worked.
In retrospect, I'd like to say this was as clear to me at the time as it is in retrospect, and it wasn't. But it feels to me that the crucial period in this campaign was basically April, May, and the beginning of June. Several things happened there that were sort of clear at the time, but much clearer in retrospect. One is, you guys emerged. You spent your $87 million. You weren't broke, but you didn't have much because the money you raised was going to be spent in the general election, couldn't be spent in the primary season. So you were sort of stuck. The Obama campaign did a great job of stepping out at that point and trying to define Mitt Romney, and you were at least handicapped in your ability to respond. But something else happened, and I think one of you mentioned it before, having the incumbency. I think it was you, Brent. The president did several things to define issues at that period. There was the gay marriage declaration. I'm in favor of gay marriage. There was the declaration on not deporting the children of illegal immigrants, which basically put a corner on a lot of the Hispanic debate at that time. And then there was the contraception fight, which, using the White House in that period, the president defined all those issues to his advantage. And then I think the last thing that happened was, and this is the part I didn't think I recognized as clearly, is I think that Governor Romney was pretty dinged up because of, not only did he have to spend $87 million, there was a like amount of money spent against him in a lot of important states by Republicans. And I was one of the moderators at the South Carolina debate. There's nothing that Barack Obama said about Bain Capital that was as harsh as what those Republican candidates said about Bain Capital that night in that debate in South Carolina. And I think that probably took a toll.
Any other thoughts from the other panelists?
Well, I actually think that a bigger moment for when we knew that it was really a two-man race was actually on Super Tuesday, because Mitt Romney had just come off of the Michigan win, and at that point it seemed mathematically almost impossible for even Rick Santorum to win, even though people were still trying to devise ways that he could do that. On the press conference that the president held on Super Tuesday, you may remember, I'm sure you both do, the president accused Republicans generally of beating the drums of war with Iran. He didn't say Mitt Romney, but it was clear that he was talking about Mitt Romney. I think it was sort of the media's fault, though, because in the days following that press conference, the media was chasing, especially the Romney press corps, was chasing this comment that Eric Fernstrom had made about Etch-a-Sketch and going from the primary to the general election. I was actually kind of ashamed of the press corps for doing that, as opposed to asking Mitt Romney what he thought of this charge from President Obama. But in the president's mind, I think it was pretty clear on that day, and he was starting to make the pivot then.
Anybody else have any thoughts you want to jump in on?
My one question, you talked about how the long primary campaign diverted resources. The panel 4 years ago talked about how it was ironic that the long Obama-Hillary Clinton campaign actually helped focus the campaign on building up turnout in states like Indiana and North Carolina that they wouldn't have had time to build up for, and made those states actually competitive in the general election because they had to fight primaries there. How come you guys were caught in this box where you had to fight Santorum, and at the same time you couldn't be building in Michigan and Ohio and Iowa, states that we were competing in, to help you in November in those states, or were you able to during that campaign?
To some extent, yes, but in a lot of these states, I think there are two distinctions between 2008 and 2012. One is open seat versus running against an incumbent. The second is money. In 2008, obviously, Senator McCain ran under the public financing. So the exact numbers, $745 million to roughly $190 million. And this time, obviously, both campaigns went outside the public financing. First time both campaigns have done that since they were instituted. But in general election states, we were able to do that. But we were also involved in a lot of primary states that were key that were not going to be general election states, whether it was South Carolina, for example. These primaries every week, to Erin's point, we felt that every week the pressure was on us to say it became a must-win state. We would win it, and then the next week they'd say it's another must-win state, and yet somehow our primary opponents never sort of run to that same thing. So, we did what we called an island hopping strategy in the primary, where we had a very small core of staff. We were not going to build bricks and mortar. We weren't going to have an enormous staff. We didn't have the resources for that, and we moved them around. We hopscotch staff around and put them in key primary states. So, went back and tried to backfill, not having the luxury of time and money to build the bricks and mortar.
Yeah, but the Obama campaign in 08, they not only island hopped, they kept their garrison there after they left. I mean, the people that worked the North Carolina primary in 08, they stayed there and developed that in the general election, from what I've been told. The same in Indiana, and those states actually became competitive because it flowed out of the primary. You guys didn't have the resources or
the resource issue was a huge contrast with what the Obama campaign experienced in 2008. We were living very much hand to mouth in the primary, and a lot of people forget that, because in the general it was a little bit more competitive, but in the primary we were just living hand to mouth, and when we got past Iowa, we sort of pulled everything and had to go on to the next state. And the other thing that, to Jerry's point and also to Erin's point, that I think we didn't really calculate during the primary season and coming out of the primary season is that regardless of the fact that the primary electorate viewed our candidate very differently from all the other candidates, that by the time the primary was done, we owned all of it. Yeah. If a Republican said it in a debate or said it publicly, we owned that. And we found ourselves, in the primary debates being asked about contraception, and Mitt Romney making very clear, specific statements that, he's not going to take away contraception, but somehow, in the verbatims we were looking at, in the spring of this year, there was this perception that Mitt Romney was going to take away contraception. And I'm sure that was aided by our friends on the other side of the table, and allegations that they were making. But there was, even all the way up till Election Day, we were fighting this perception among women that if Mitt Romney was elected president, you weren't going to have access to contraceptives, which, to all of us seems completely absurd. So we spent a good part of the year really just constantly trying to get back and focused on the economy and not be talking about peripheral issues that were neither priorities of Mitt Romney's nor were, in any way even factually true.
One thing that I've always been wondering, and since you guys are here, we can now ask you.
Thanks, Jeff.
You said you were living hand to mouth. You were didn't have much money, but that was a choice that the governor made to have a much smaller and more leaner operation this time than 2008. Was it frustrating as things were going on that this is, the wealthiest person who's ever run for president, that you didn't have more money to deal with, that he wasn't putting more money in, and you didn't have a bigger operation like you had in 08? And would that have been helpful, do you think, in hindsight?
It was, I'll let Rich answer for himself, but it was never frustrating to me that we didn't have a bigger organization. I was part of the operation in 08 and never felt like, never one time felt that our operation in 08 was superior to our operation in 2012. Certainly all through the primary season, I felt like we were far more nimble, and you're forced to make tough choices when you're operating within the parameters of a budget. And so I think you make smarter choices and you make correct choices. I never begrudged Mitt Romney not putting in millions and millions of dollars. I think he felt very strongly that he did not want there to be a perception that he was buying this election. He was going about it the old-fashioned way. He was raising the money, raising the funds that he needed, and he worked harder, I'll say, than any candidate I've ever seen going out and raising the money. And it is not a small thing to go toe-to-toe with the President of the United States and be able to compete from a fundraising standpoint. It's hard to compete with Air Force One and the Marine Band when you're out raising money. And the fact that he didn't do that he didn't put in his own money, I never begrudged.
Can I raise a question here, though, that there's a dog that didn't bark in this period we're talking about. There was...
We don't talk about dogs.
You're right. There's a cat that didn't meow in this period. Okay, so the narrative was supposed to be that even though you guys had run low on money you could spend in the primaries in this period we're talking about, there were all these super PACs out there who were supposed to step in and fill the gap, and it wouldn't be a problem. Didn't matter how much money you guys had, they had $300-400 million. But it didn't quite click. What happened? Why didn't the super PACs do in this period what you guys couldn't do?
Well, there's a lot of explanations for that, but the first part is we don't control the message. I mean,
right.
Super PACs are their own entity, and I think that's one of the Fred Wertheimer. The Super PACs are a direct descendant of Fred Wertheimer. I mean, they try to get money out of politics, and all they do is move it out to Super PACs where campaigns and parties don't control the message. But both campaigns at the end of the day are going to raise over $1 billion. I mean, it's just an incredible amount of money when you think about it. So to your question, Jeff, about fundraising, our Governor Romney and our finance team, raising over $1 billion. I don't think anybody would have thought a challenger campaign could have ever done that. The difference is $300 million that I think you very wisely spent building up an infrastructure early on. Our money came later when it was just like getting a golf ball through a garden hose towards the end there. Both campaigns had adequate resources at the end. It was just the timing of the money at the front. So anybody who's critical of Governor Romney not putting money in is I think not very well informed. But also, I'm guessing our friends over there would have been waiting on him to write a check, and that would have reiterated the whole.
We wouldn't have said it.
I'm sure. I've got to know Jeremy after post-election. I know he's truthful about that. So, but on the Super PAC question, Jerry, it's just it's to your point about a dog. That's a dog that's off the leash. You don't control it at all. What they say and what they do. Going back in hindsight, you'd have loved to have them done one thing or another, but we just don't control it, and that's the way it's set up. And I think it's one of the big holes in campaign finance right now.
I do think it's a little unfair, though, to suggest that that they were failures. I mean, I think that the Obama campaign probably would acknowledge that their path might have been a little bit easier had the super PACs not engaged in the spring and summer against their candidate. I think that they made a strategic decision. You can do two things. They could either defend Mitt Romney, right, which we didn't have the resources right to do at the time, or they could go after the president. And I think that they were looking, and we're seeing some of this for the first time, just like everybody else is, and heard from them at the Harvard Symposium. But they looked at the data and felt that the most compelling messages that they could pursue were to attack the president as opposed to trying to play defense on our behalf. And had they not done that, this race may have been over much earlier. We don't really have any way of knowing that. But I think it's a little unfair to suggest that somehow they didn't do their job. I think that they did a very effective job in creating the sort of referendum on President Obama that we were trying to do as well. So I guess that's just a difference of opinion.
Okay. One of the questions that I don't have time to get to tomorrow, but since we're talking so much about money, does anybody have any strong feelings on our panel about how effective the super PACs were in this cycle? Because we saw a lot written about them, but I'm not really sure how effective they were. You guys think they were super effective? Anybody, thoughts?
I expected that we would see the super PACs filling in the gap a little more on organization on our side. Because it was clear that you all you had the problem of you had to use your money in media, I'll use old-fashioned terms, in media, establishing your image and messaging early on through all those primaries. But then you clearly had to move from state to state without having the ability of leaving behind offices that could keep your operation going. And so I always thought that the super PACs would take that on. I thought that's what Koch's people were going to do and that sort of thing. And we never saw any evidence of it, I know, in New Hampshire. We never saw any evidence of it in some of the other battleground states where I was.
It's a valid point, but you don't have the imprimatur of being...
Not that you could direct that.
Well, not only that, but you don't have the imprimatur of being the RNC or the Romney campaign. It was one of the things I looked longingly at Jeremy's operation. Theirs was all the Obama campaign. They didn't even have to deal, for the most part, with the DNC. It was the Obama campaign. So you can get volunteers to come volunteer for the Obama campaign as opposed to, what's this Americans for Prosperity and why do they want me? So having the imprimatur of the party and the candidate is much more significant. And to your point about money and the super PACs, it's an equal footing. Again, you look at 2008, 745 million to 190 million. It's just having the ability to not bring a knife to a gunfight. It's having the same level of noise out there. So.
And I think there's a practical point here too, and I'm sure there's academics here who will look into this and are much smarter on this than I am, but it felt just from where we were sitting at a certain point that there was a saturation point on television, regardless of who was putting up the TV ads, and that you ended up with a canceling effect in a lot of places, that the ads were on so long and that the ad point totals were so high that people just tuned out. And what that means is that things like ground game, things like earned media, things like phone calls, just the relative importance of that, each one of those actions goes up, right? So, they were effective in a neutralizing way, but I don't think we ever felt that a super PAC ad moved a message point on us effectively. And that could be either saturation or maybe they just weren't hitting the mark on what the American people would buy about the president. And that's the other thing too, and this is an incumbency advantage that can be good or bad, is that, the president, everyone knows the president. I mean, he has been in the public eye since, in a very real way, going back to 2004, and in a very, very high-profile way, going back to he started running in 2007. So I think that the Romney campaign and the super PACs had a bit of an uphill battle in terms of some of the definitional points you were trying to make. And the one that always sticks out to me is Solyndra. Not as much as in what the Romney campaign was doing, but in the super PAC ads, it was very much not just about squandering money and stewardship of government. It was a trust thing about him, that he had done something nefarious. I think most Americans at the end of the day don't think Barack Obama's a nefarious guy. Because they've seen him, and again, agree with him or not on things, they've seen him as a family man, they've watched him succeed and fail at things, but always be pretty straight with folks. So that was just too high a mountain to climb after 6 years of contrary evidence or contrary narrative. So,
I think that to your point, we saw that repeatedly, and it was one of the most frustrating things in our campaign, in focus group after focus group, when you would sit down, with this sort of narrow slice of voters, undecided female voters who had voted for Barack Obama in 2008, getting them to believe anything negative about the president. They weren't there, they weren't ready to vote for Barack Obama yet, but when we would test message point after message point after message point, there was almost nothing that would stick to this guy, because they did just like him personally, and they were almost willing to put up with the fact that he wasn't working for the country because they just liked him.
Yeah.
But going back to your original question about the super PACs, one place I think that it had a huge impact was in the primaries. And clearly, we saw in state after state the super PACs that were working on our behalf making a huge impact, with the luggage ad in Iowa, and then heading down to Florida going after Speaker Gingrich. We saw it having a huge impact, but the other place that it had a big impact was that, to Rich's earlier point of, these must-win primaries, traditionally, you win a primary, somebody drops out. Because resources, just sort of stall when you lose a primary, certainly one that you're expected to win. And when we came out of our short-lived win in Iowa, you would have typically seen several candidates drop out at that point. But all of these candidates had one or two big donors that could keep them alive a while longer, and that's what sort of created this long slog effect. And so had there not been super PACs that were bolstering Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum, this primary certainly would have wrapped up a lot earlier, because these candidates could not have sustained their operations and their efforts, going on into April. So from that standpoint, it was a big
I think that's
impact.
really important. You want to say something on that?
Go ahead.
Well, I think the other thing that is that when we're talking about the general election, we're talking about this in the plural, right? They didn't have a super PAC; they had super PACs.
Right.
If you break it down, super PAC's not an entity; it's people. Right? They're people that are working in an office. Many of whom have done this for a long time. A lot of people don't just start their own super PAC and raise millions of dollars. These are essentially campaign managers on the other side who all don't have necessarily the same idea about what message might hit most. We would sometimes get kind of contradictory ads. Some were, look, the president's a good guy, he's just failed, right? Which is probably the most effective message at the time. But then the next ad that the viewer would see is the president's a terrible guy, right? And this is why he's a terrible guy. That's really hard, right? Whereas we had a super PAC that, early on had about $10 in the bank, but ended up, raised a significant amount of money. I think had some pretty good ads, but it was one super PAC. And so even though there were two entities, there was still, it's much less likely that you were going to get two different ads or three different ads about Mitt Romney kind of back to back to back like you might get on the other side. So I think that played a role as well.
And I think Brent's point about saturation is really important as well too. I know as we were building our operation, we were looking to finish building our field operation by convention, and not, traditionally a campaign starts or whatever between September and November. And if we knew all the ads were going to be on the air at that point, if we had a good ground game ready to go by convention time, that's when the other types of ways to get the message out really matter, right? So digital was more important probably after September. That's when we were really hitting doors and trying to get our message out, because at that point in time, to Bert's point, you have super PACs, you have campaigns, et cetera. It gets a little bit cluttered, so how can we get our message out in different ways too? So we had that point at the convention saying we have to be done in each individual state doing what we're trying to do and just really execute the ground game at that point in time to
And that goes back to integration. There is a, no offense to all of our journalist friends here, but people tend to think of communications on a campaign as just being press, right? And that's only one small piece of what we do. And we really viewed all of our folks on the doors as communicators. We wanted to make sure that there was a consistency of message up and down the totem pole, and it wasn't always easy to do. It's a big organization, but that interaction is just as much a communication as a TV ad or a place story or a speech.
On the super PAC things for 1 second, was there ever any discussion in Boston like that maybe some donor could appeal to Foster Friess, who is a Rick Santorum sort of benefactor, or to Sheldon Adelson, who is Newt Gingrich's benefactor, to sort of like stop writing these checks because you're sort of damaging the Romney? What were some of those conversations like?
Well, I mean, certainly, there was discussion about the fact that, if this just went on indefinitely, even though, to borrow a line from my friend, it would have taken an act of God for anybody but Mitt Romney to win that primary at some point. That it did come to a point where it was just very damaging to the party and damaging to Mitt. There were conversations to the, to kind of appeal to the long-term goal that, all of these guys, whether it was, Adelson or Friess or any of these guys, they were all loyal Republicans who had stated public goals of wanting to defeat Barack Obama. So certainly there were conversations about, are there common friends here that could have conversations with them and sort of appeal to their common sense. And I think, at some point that did prevail.
And Governor Romney himself was involved in some of these conversations, right?
Well,
he had a meeting with Sheldon Adelson. And
yeah, I mean, he always maintained, a relationship with Sheldon, not particularly, close, chummy friends like you all try to portray. But, he had conversations with him and had a relationship with him prior to the election or to the campaign. So, there were discussions like that all the time that, believe me, I mean, you were around. There was nobody that wanted that slog to come to an end as much as we did.
One of the things that I want to get everybody to comment a little bit on, some of you have already commented on this, and I think somebody on my staff leaked my discussion topics to Jeff Zeleny here today. But, because you mentioned the media that the president's campaign did in the summer. I think a lot of casual observers, I think a lot of us thought, well, that's not going to stick, but it obviously did. What were your perceptions at the time, everybody, when the president was running this strong media campaign right as the governor was securing the nomination? What was your reaction at the time?
I thought Romney emerged pretty damaged from the primary process, and when he was still weak and people were starting to tune in, I think it was very effective. The cancer ad, which is an example from the super PACs, basically no money ever went behind that. Some money to put it on YouTube, but it broke through in a pretty amazing way as an example of an ad that was not accurate in a lot of ways, and still like broke through.
Right.
And it had an impact. And so I think that you talked about the 20 debates helping him win in Denver, and it's absolutely correct. But it was 20 debates where he was also on the record, saying a ton of different things, as you mentioned in your verbatims, being tied to all these things that he didn't necessarily say. And so all of a sudden, I think he was kicked pretty hard when he was down. And there were a lot of people that I talked to all year who didn't like Obama. The thrill of 2008 was gone, but they couldn't or wouldn't or didn't vote for Mitt Romney. There were a lot of people who should have been Romney voters that just couldn't close the deal. I think some of that was the emphasis on keeping it a referendum in the early advertising, in the super PAC advertising, and not defining that choice early enough.
Yeah, and I think too, and this goes back to an earlier point about the damage that was done in the primary by your opponents. A lot of what we were pushing wasn't new. It was reinforcing things that might already be in people's consciousness, either because it was said in the primary or because he had a bio to fight that led to people, having a certain preconception about a businessman and someone who had been successful in the way he had. And that worked for us, obviously, in our favor on Bain. It wasn't, we didn't have to push the boulder up the hill. We just had to get the boulder rolling. And some of it, too, I think, there was a period in there, it's always funny, it's the bias of inevitability, right? This is all inevitable after the fact, but at the time, these were all choices. And there was a time when many in the press and in the political kind of intelligentsia were telling us that Bain wasn't working. And what we were seeing was it might not be getting coverage in national press, but we were generating story after story after story in local papers in Ohio and in places you wouldn't think, you know what I mean? And this is where really the mechanics of campaigns are so interesting. It's, you get the Bain boulder rolling down the hill, and then you have a strong research department. We had a fantastic research department on our campaign. They were able to go out and find, well, what media markets can we find where there's a Bain tie? In places you wouldn't think, like Las Vegas, Nevada, where there was a company that had been bought by Bain and failed. Well, all of a sudden, we now have an entree into that media market to talk about this thematic, and a thematic that's really about who this man would be as a leader, not necessarily a business deal that happened with a bunch of stores in Las Vegas. So I think we were very, very fortunate. And we ran a slow burn. We did that with the Massachusetts record stuff, too, where we had, we knew that was a potential advantage for you guys, especially on the bipartisanship front. I think, I'm sure your guys' focus groups all said the same things ours did, that was a real winner. So we had Massachusetts officials out running around the country doing little stand-up press conferences in small markets in Ohio. And again, this isn't going to generate CNN-type coverage, but it's that drip, drip, drip to keep that narrative going that was important for us.
Can I say one more thing about the discussion? So, this was a very big decision in the campaign. Every decision should be about spending people's money. People are giving their money because they support Barack Obama. And we felt very strongly that we should be stewards of that money. This was not somebody dropping a $10 million check and saying, here, spend it. It was people giving, on average, $50. So we had to make a big decision. And we, frankly, early on in 2012, the money online wasn't coming in like it did in 2008. So we had to make a huge bet that come fall, that money was going to come in probably higher than we even thought we could project. And, Marlon and I wanted as many staff as we possibly could have because we wanted to run up some of the registration numbers. And, we had to make some choices there early. And it was a big gamble and I give Messina and Axelrod a lot of credit for saying, look, we have to look at the long game here and we need to make this definition now because we've been defined. We have been out there for years now and a lot of people, there's been some definition obviously in the primary, but still people that, particularly independents who aren't paying attention as much to a Republican primary, we needed to make that definition. But it was a huge gamble, of which I think a lot of people would have made a different decision because we couldn't guarantee that money was going to come in like it ended up coming in towards the end, especially given all that we've been hearing from all the reporters up here about the enthusiasm gap. So, it was tough. It was a big decision, and I think it paid off, but it could have not, and it took a lot of risk.
You bet the bank at that point,
Yeah.
essentially.
Well, we bet the idea of the bank.
The promise of the bank. Yeah. But Bill, to your question, to me as an observer, somebody who's seen some of these campaigns before, during this period you're asking about, it felt to me like everything was upside down on both sides. That what you guys are supposed to do is start post-primary running ads that define your candidate, and instead you guys started with here are the first 10 things Mitt Romney would do. And you guys were supposed to start small and positive and build to negative and big later, and you did exactly the opposite. So I don't know if, Jeff, you had the same perception, or Erin, that as a journalist, it's like, well, wait, they're not doing what they're supposed to do. In fact, they're doing the opposite of what they're supposed to do here. And I don't know if we've got a new paradigm or what, but it wasn't conventional.
We did feel, though, that by outlining what Mitt Romney would do as president, that we were defining our candidate. That, when we were, testing, ads, we found over and over that what people really wanted to know, and this is where the choice came in, is, you've already said that Barack Obama has been a failure. what is Mitt Romney going to do that's different? And so that was, sort of defining Mitt Romney. But going back to one thing I just want to mention, and I think that this was one of the, part of the genius of the Obama campaign was that they sort of sliced up the electorate, and it wasn't just coming out of the gate and running ads, in a conventional way. We would sit in these meetings every morning and look at the volume of ads, different ads that were all sort of reinforcing, the message that Brent spoke about, which was, I'm like you, I'm, gonna strengthen the economy by strengthening the middle class. But they were running a lot of different ads, targeted a lot of different groups, very specific messaging targeted at women, targeted at young people, targeted at Hispanic voters, saying a lot of things in Spanish ads that none of the press ever covered. Apparently they couldn't figure out how to translate those ads. But a lot of very specific targeted things that I don't think they ever would have said on broadcast English television ads. And really, driving up enthusiasm among, both their core and independent voters, state by state and media market by media market, in a really brilliant way that we would have loved to have been able to mimic back in May and June of this year.
Yeah, and I just think the one point on this that I hope folks understand is that it was geographic as much as it was constituency-based. I mean, Ohio is the perfect example. We ran a much different campaign from a messaging standpoint in western and northwestern Ohio, which was all autos all the time, than we did in southeastern Ohio, which was basically coal country, right? So, and yes, they got the top level macro messaging, but there was a lot of drill down on specific issues that mattered in specific places.
Yeah, I don't think we ever heard the words affordable health care in an English-speaking television ad in any state. But in Hispanic television advertising, it was repeated over and over again. So that was just an example of the kind of very specific messaging that they were very good at.
We had a meeting every day at 10 o'clock where we would go through all of that. And one thing, like to your point about different markets, we would see what you were doing in Norfolk and Columbus. We'd call it a day in the life in Columbus, and we'd see sometimes 9 different creatives up in Columbus, throughout the day, different times, advertising heavy early in the morning for a certain group, and then through the day. So it was fascinating to watch and plot. It was just 2 different strategies.
As that was going on, did you think that was a waste of money, or?
No, go ahead.
Was that?
I think that there were different opinions.
But at the same time, in a post-campaign in a post-public financing world, you're not as driven by resources at that point.
Erin, did you have something?
Yeah, you had mentioned testing Mitt Romney's governorship and how his bipartisan nature as governor was a winner for them. And one thing that struck me throughout the general election is how little we talked about Mitt Romney as a governor. And, I think obviously Bain, as we were just talking about, was a huge driver of your ad strategy. And I think in some ways, Cory Booker and his comments on Meet the Press was, even though Democrats were upset about it at the time, probably a winner because we talked about private equity for so long. But when you were defining Romney, I was shocked by the lack of any kind of messaging or ad strategy about his record in Massachusetts. And I'm sure that was done to some point, but I just didn't think that it ever broke through. And toward the end, obviously there was an ad saying that he was a bipartisan governor and had that ability and could bring people together as maybe the president couldn't. But there were many times that I thought that was a topic that the media could delve into more and just never really did. And I think part of the reason was because I just don't think that it really was seen as part of the messaging strategy.
Well, can I say, you guys know this obviously better than me, but I'm interested in this. I mean, in the primary, you can't come out with Mitt Romney as governor because it's going to be all about Romney care. So you can't make that you can't open with that, and so you'd have to sort of like add it on once the general starts. And
if you could get past that, Massachusetts wasn't a particularly popular place to be a governor from.
Exactly.
Happy to have my friend Jeremy continue to speak for us. He's doing a great job. So.
I have one more subject I want to cover before we move into a discussion of the convention.
We'll cover that.
Okay.
And that's the selection of Congressman Ryan as the governor's vice presidential candidate. Katie and Rich, can you guys comment a little bit on that? And then can I get the reaction that the Obama campaign had, and then ask the journalists and Nancy and Joe just to give their thoughts on that selection.
Well, I think that that our process was something that was pretty well covered at the time and was a very, very closed process. I mean, if you were inside the campaign, it was no more broadly, spoken of than was perceived. This was very much, a process that Mitt Romney sort of laid out as the process that he wanted to pursue. He was very, very clear in his goals that he wanted to have somebody who was ready on day one to be president, and that was the primary overriding goal. I don't know that I ever heard a conversation about the vice president candidate in the context of how it would help politically. And I don't know if Rich has a different sense on that, but it was always very much about somebody who could be a governing partner with Mitt Romney. I think, probably the first kind of contact we had or opportunity to look at the two of them together was during the Wisconsin primary and the lead up to that, and Congressman Ryan had endorsed about a week out from that primary. And I was on the road with them a good deal during that time, and for the press that were covering it, it was very obvious, the chemistry between these two guys. They just sort of clicked. And, Mitt's a really, really smart guy. And, to be able to sit and interact with somebody like Ryan, who really just sort of, I don't know what the right word is, but just sort of challenged his thinking, and was somebody that was sort of a match for him privately, was really interesting. And I remember, not even in the context of a VP candidate, but I remember, talking with Rich and Matt and others back at headquarters and saying, wow, this, they're just great together. We should do town hall meetings. And, we talked about that a lot, that there was a very clear chemistry. And so I think, as he was, working with Beth Myers and narrowing down, the potential candidates and looking for what he wanted moving forward, I think he felt that Ryan was a bold choice. He was not somebody that was undefined and did not, come with some very specific sets of beliefs. But it was just a very natural, I think a natural choice for him, and at the end of the day was sort of an easy choice.
I just want to peel back the curtain a little bit for the folks here, and you guys probably went through this in 2008, but I would continually get calls from friends of mine back home in Colorado or around the country saying, hey, what are you hearing on the VP selection? I would say, I don't know, what are you hearing? Because that's about how much we were involved in it. It was this was a Governor Romney and Beth Myers and a very small group of people, and it was ultimately his decision. For me, I was very excited. We had a guy who was a Generation X candidate. We had a guy who could appeal to sportsmen, to Catholics, to blue-collar Dems. The district that he represented in Wisconsin was formerly represented by a Democrat, Les Aspin, for a long time. So this was a guy that we knew we could appeal to a lot of different segments. So from just a purely political point of view, I was pretty excited. So.
And a lot of people thought that we had all this advance notice because the announcement was made at the USS Wisconsin and down in Virginia. And really, I think the opportunity sort of presented itself. But Rich and I were involved in the selection of that particular venue before either of us knew that Paul Ryan was the pick. So there literally was no correlation between the two.
Yeah, we joked and did you have like alternative battleships ready? But
maybe the Minnesota.
That's right. I got to figure out where all these things went. For us, look, I think first of all, the premise that everyone has to keep in mind whenever you talk about a VP pick is that people vote for the top of the ticket. You know what I mean? Like no one's walking into a voting booth, pulling a lever, saying, "I really want Paul Ryan to be vice president." So you got to look at what does that mean that the vice presidential choice is about. Well, there's a practical side to it. Bringing a second person onto the ticket, it spreads the field. It gives you a surrogate at a level that you didn't have before. And I think that the Romney campaign should feel incredibly good about how Ryan helped in that regard. He was a great campaigner. He got out there, worked his ass off. In a lot of ways, very similar to what Biden did for us in 2008, in an ability to go into markets that did respond to more of a blue-collar feel, Catholic markets, places like that. So, but again, so there's kind of the practical side of what they physically do to help the campaign. Then the other side is and the way we viewed the VP pick, regardless of who you would have picked, is it's the first really big decision the candidate makes, and it's what does it say about the candidate. And to us, and what we push, and I think this is one of those instances where talking points weren't spin; they were just what we thought. We felt like that was really putting your arms around the Ryan budget, and to us that was a good thing, because the great thing about a budget, anyone who's ever worked in Congress knows or had to deal with a budget process, is it touches everything. So it gave us a window into how we talked about the economic philosophy that we were painting onto the Romney campaign that touched every single person in every single corner of the country. Because a budget impacts you no matter what. No matter how you feel about government, the budget impacts you on some level. So that was our rallying cry was, he's a great spokesperson, but he's a great spokesperson for a philosophy that we don't agree with, and that philosophy is now encoded. It's now written down in a document, and we can pull stuff out of that document and use it in press events, use it in ads, use it in places like that. So for us, we saw it as an opportunity for us.
And I think that's right. I think also organizationally speaking, in a place like Wisconsin, our volunteers got a lot more motivated. And so we were able to kind of even invest a little bit more on the field side in Wisconsin to take advantage of that. And another state I think that was really important too was Florida. And that was a time where myself and Jeremy got a chance to look at Florida and say, and we had a nice investment obviously in Florida, but the Ryan budget there was a huge issue. And so how it played to our volunteers there and people who were organizing on our behalf, it really got them fired up. And so we were able to kind of take advantage of that also and then kind of increase our voter registration there. So not necessarily Paul Ryan specifically, I agree, but to Brent's point, what is that issue that can be defined that we can then use to our advantage to help continue to build an organization as well?
Okay, I'm going to go around and ask the panelists, and I'll start with you, Jeff. What did you think it signaled when Ryan was selected?
At the time, it was breaking on a Friday night. It was very closely held. So that's one thing that's obviously very frustrating as a reporter, but it was very, it was difficult to break, but once it was clear on that Friday evening going into that Saturday morning, it did seem like a very sort of bold pick, and it seemed sort of un-Romney-like, at least what people thought of Governor Romney. People sort of assumed it would be Senator Portman. I always thought it would be the former governor of Minnesota, Governor Pawlenty. But anyway, I think people thought it was a bold choice. It was, you could see the energy up there on the stage in Virginia that day. But I went out to Wisconsin the next day for their first rally together in Wisconsin. Huge crowd out in the western suburbs of Milwaukee. But even by then, I was a little bit struck by the messaging was already becoming a bit of a problem. And the Romney people were saying, it's the Romney-Ryan plan, not the Ryan-Romney ticket. And I'm not sure that from a message point of view that obviously everyone was kept in the dark, that you guys were as prepared to sort of get ready on the, this is Romney-Ryan in that order as opposed to a Ryan-Romney. But at the very beginning it was very, very, very bold. And then I think like all vice presidential candidates, you just sort of, you become the number two. Unless you're Sarah Palin, you become the number two. And I think that, overall though, I think that it was a strong pick for the Republican ticket.
Okay, Erin?
I don't think that it was particularly surprising at all. I think that timing was surprising, and my initial read on the timing was that the Romney campaign badly needed to turn the page on the very bad foreign trip that they had generated a lot of bad press coverage, and they just wanted to move into the next phase of the campaign. But I don't think the pick was surprising, and what it told me is that Paul Ryan passed whatever tests that Mitt Romney had for him. And the first time it was clear that Paul Ryan was going to be in the Veep stakes was sometime in May, when the campaign had advised that Paul Ryan was going to headline a town hall style discussion or some sort of roundtable in North Carolina. And then one by one, you saw Tim Pawlenty go to North Carolina, and then Rob Portman do the same. And Bobby Jindal had a couple of his events, but it was very clear who was on the list. And you saw all of these candidates go through different kinds of tryouts, and by the end of it, it was pretty clear that it was going to be Paul Ryan. The other thing I would point out is
Erin actually had the minutes tabulated of how much time each of these candidates spent on
I did do a lot of stuff on the Veep stakes. I will say that, but I think one thing that I think a gut feeling for me that it was potentially going to be Paul Ryan was that there was a Washington Post profile on Rob Portman that you may remember that was very detailed. And the reporter had talked to many of Rob Portman's best friends. It was clear that Rob Portman wanted the job, but there was one line in the 14th paragraph of the story where someone had said somewhere within the Romney campaign, you know, Rob Portman and Mitt Romney get along, but he really likes Paul Ryan and their chemistry is better. And to me, that meant something.
Nancy, Joe?
Just for the record, that could have been any one of us without any real knowledge of the specific ones.
Nancy or Joe, you guys have any thoughts on this?
I have a couple thoughts. I mean, unlike a lot of you, I was shocked by the decision. And I know Mitt very well, and I know that Paul Ryan is just the kind of person he'd like to campaign with, he'd like to work with in his administration. He is a lot like his sons. They are on the same wavelength. But I was shocked. I mean, I was on the phone with a good friend of ours, Joe Gaylord, when the announcement came across my screen, and I said, there goes Florida. I mean, I was just shocked about Florida. I was shocked about Wisconsin, because I knew that the volunteer base in Wisconsin was highly motivated on both sides, and I thought this was just going to put more oil, more gas into your side, get your people going. So that really worried me, and I frankly expected it would have been somebody such as Rob Portman, you know, to help with Ohio, which clearly to me was, you know, we were so close, we needed a boost. So I have to admit, I was shocked. I hate to judge it, but I do think it was a very significant decision in the campaign, almost as significant as the 47%.
Mm-hmm. What I think is interesting is Brent's right in that the academic literature and the political conventional wisdom is vice presidential candidates don't win or lose the election. And I think this will go down as one that it probably didn't make a win or a lose picking Ryan, but it does change the story. And if you just hypothetically look at other options. I mean, Portman could have closed that 3-point gap potentially, or at least redirected your resources in Ohio in a different way. Think of Chris Christie being the VP and Sandy hitting New Jersey a week before the election. The entire story of the campaign changes. Obama may still win, but the entire story is different. Think of Marco Rubio as the VP. Again, a high-risk choice, but it would change the entire story. I mean, a Romney-Rubio ticket probably would have lost by the same margin, but it probably wouldn't have lost Florida, and it definitely wouldn't have lost Cubans in Florida. So while the overall effect of a VP doesn't matter, it does change the storyline quite a bit, who you pick.
James?
All those things, it felt like a desperate Hail Mary to us, and he not only those things that you just talked about, but Paul Ryan didn't bring the people he was ultimately supposed to. Like, obviously, Wisconsin was always going to be a heavy lift, but heavily Catholic areas, Romney underperformed among a lot of the whites that you'd expect, the sportsmen that he was supposed to help with. And it felt like a very un-Mitt move, something that I think challenged people's conceptions of who Romney was for the better, but at the end of the day didn't help in the way it was supposed to.
Nancy,
I actually prefer when Jeremy criticizes this. If we could go back to him and let him
I expected afterwards when I was thinking, why did you do this, and what was the reason that I didn't ask him this question, but I was thinking it. And I thought, well, maybe your campaign was going to reorient its entire message and take on the Ryan plan and really go on it and sort of suddenly change the message and the strategy. And I thought that was so unlike Mitt to be that bold, but I thought perhaps that was what was going to happen. And then we had this problem of the Ryan, Romney, Ryan, what do we call it? Very, very soon after that.
Well, I think
so it was not planned.
I think it's inconceivable to the media, I'm sure to our opponents and probably to, a lot of folks on our side of the aisle, that Mitt would make a decision like this with so little political calculus. But I'm not blowing smoke when I say he really came at this from the perspective of governing and really felt like, I was, party to conversations with him that were, not specific to candidates, but sort of what his thinking was. And he always talked very much in terms of, to the point that somebody made about what it says about him, what his choice says about him, and what it means to the country. He felt that a very strong obligation, not only that this was somebody he was going to have to partner with, but that if anything happened to him, this was a guy that would be president of the United States. And the magnitude of that was never, ever lost on him. And there was very little political calculus. And, and I think that there's a lot that can be said of, oh, if we had had Portman, would it have made a difference in Ohio? But everything changes if you pick somebody different. And if you pick Portman, do you then sort of walk into 8 years of George W. Bush?
Yes.
If you pick... You pick Marco Rubio, what are the unknowns that you walk into there? If I was somebody who just loved Tim Pawlenty just personally. I mean, this is a guy that came on board our campaign at a really critical time and was so committed to our campaign and just personally very, very well liked. But you don't know what the issues are that you walk into there. So any candidate that you latch onto, everything changes. But I will say that if you were writing a book as a political operative of the kind of candidate you'd like to have come into your campaign, a year and a half into the process, Paul Ryan is the guy that you'd want. I mean, this was a guy who was tireless. He was a guy that never embarrassed our party or our campaign or our candidate. His team just became a part of our team. And, I think it was one of the wisest choices I've ever seen Mitt make. And certainly if he had it to do over again, I think he would do it exactly the same way.
This is just real quick, funny aside. One of the things you should feel really good about running against an incumbent is not having to go through the prep process for the other side picking a VP candidate. It is the worst thing in the world, because basically what happens is everybody who's on the short list, every single thing we had ready for Tim Ryan, we had ready for everybody else, right? So whatever the elements of our reactive rollout is, a website, a video, research packet, all this stuff.
Jeff will get you the website for
that's
this.
Right. I don't think folks know is that there's like this whole world in campaigns of the campaign that never happened, right? Like the ad you never ran or the speech you never gave, and all that stuff gets made and then just goes away. And what's funny is the other kind of rule of campaigns is you're always fighting the last campaign in a way, right? You're trying to not make the mistakes you made 4 years ago, and you have to really guard against it. The 2004 version of this was the number of people we had ready for a recount on election day. We had, we overshot the runway on the number of lawyers that were sitting around waiting for a recount, right? Because we felt so unprepared in 2000. Well, the version this time was the Sarah Palin reaction, where you would do an event with an elected official, and we would put together a whole path. They're like, well, maybe it's IOT. You did a New Hampshire event with her like 2 weeks before, which makes total sense to do. But we were like, is this, smoke signals that she might be the pick? We got to make sure we've got a video on her and all this stuff. So I think we ended up preparing for like 12 people. I mean, it was kind of crazy. And then you guys announced your pick that Saturday morning, and all that work just goes away. Yeah.
Well, I remember having a conversation with Erin about this sort of calculation of all these candidates and the amount of face time that they'd had with Mitt Romney. And I think I talked to Rich about it the next morning and said, wow, it all seems very calculated from the outside. They don't really realize that we're just going, well, we've got Tim Pawlenty that day. Where should we send it?
Yeah.
Jerry, do you have any thoughts on the
Just
Ryan selection?
a couple of quick ones. First of all, I'll share with you, Brent, the files I had reporters work on Marco Rubio, Vice President. They'll match. A couple of things just quickly, Bill. One is, having lived through Quayle and Lieberman and Palin, I think I'm beyond surprised, so I don't think I was surprised. Secondly, I'm glad to hear what you said, because my secret thought was it was going to be Tim Pawlenty, because he was such a good surrogate, I thought. Third, I remember thinking two things when he was named. One was, wow, I guess there won't be an Etch-a-Sketch moment. And second, I remember thinking that the calculation of Governor Romney must have been you guys were going to hang the Paul Ryan budget around my neck anyway, so I might as well embrace it. And the final thought I have is, all things considered, I think he did maybe better, Nancy, than you're giving him credit for. Because if you were at the convention, there really was a good night when he spoke. And, I don't know whether he was responsible for Florida tipping the other way or not. But I think overall, he was a really good campaigner and probably better than I thought.
Okay, I want to move along to the conventions, and we're going to try to take a break as soon as we get through the conventions. And I just want to address very broad questions on each convention. Let's do the Republican convention first. Katie and Rich, can you guys speak to what your objectives were, and what can you tell us about Clint Eastwood's speech?
Thought you'd never ask.
If you don't mind, Bill, I'd like to just take a quick step back.
Yes.
And just mention one thing. Coming out of the primaries, Mitt Romney was the nominee of the party, but I think it was clear that he was not yet the leader of the party. And there was a lot of sort of coming together that had to be done. And I think that there were two pivotal moments for us in the general election that led to that place. The first one was the Paul Ryan pick. I think that there was a lot of skepticism. Is this guy a real moderate? And when it comes to make this decision, is he going to make a moderate choice? And I think picking Paul Ryan was a window into his soul that said this guy's a conservative and is going to govern as a conservative. And then that first debate. And I think after those two things, that's when it became about more than just beating Barack Obama for our party. That's when it became about electing Mitt Romney. So I think that those were two really important moments, and Paul Ryan's pick was certainly a part of that.
Good points.
But I'll let you talk about the convention.
Well, they don't usually let the political guys determine what the message should be or what you want to accomplish. But clearly, is introducing Governor Romney and Congressman Ryan to the American people. From my perspective, of sort of comparing it to like an iceberg, 80% of the iceberg is below. It's all of everything that was going on underneath. And folks forget maybe they don't. I certainly never will. Is the Ron Paul factor. While even though we had the nomination sewn up, you had Ron Paul still competing in state conventions, competing for delegates. If he would have gotten a majority of 5 delegations, they could have nominated him from the floor. Also, you had Ron Paul delegates on key committees that whether it was rules, any number of the committees at the convention. So there was a whole sort of another part of that convention that we had to deal with. Now, we worked with the Ron Paul people early on, made them feel inclusive in the process, and I think at the end of the day mitigated the damage at the convention. They were very well behaved. And
can I ask you a question about that? Because I was thinking this watching the convention. You guys did make the decision not to announce how many delegates Ron Paul got in each state. And a state like Iowa would vote, and it'd be Romney 20 votes, Ron Paul 12 votes, and the person announcing the votes would say, Romney 20 votes. No, not announce Paul's votes. And he only got 185 votes or whatever, but it was like a specific, we're not even going to let your votes be announced. And I know there might have been some antagonism there, but that just seemed like a step of like, we're not even going to announce that you guys were here. And as you look at the results, I mean, it's small numbers, but in a race that could have been close. Gary Johnson got 1.3 million votes. The state of Maine just announced there were 2,000 write-in votes for Ron Paul in Maine, even though he didn't want to write in votes or whatever. People in Maine were so upset, 2,000 of them wrote in Ron Paul. In retrospect, was that just a little too antagonistic towards them, or was there more of a way?
I think if you go back and look at the total part of how we brought them in, part of the process, the Ron Paul leadership, whether it's Jesse Benton, any number of folks inside the Ron Paul campaign are going to say they were treated far more respectfully, far more inclusively than they were in 2008. They were a part of that convention. So, can we go through and find specific things? Sure. But I think all in all, they were. We made them feel welcome and respected in the process.
There was a faction, though, of the Ron Paul supporters that no matter what you did, they were sort of a protest vote. So I don't think that there's offering them cabinet positions was going to make a difference on that front. So I don't think that really was an important factor.
So, overall, I think the convention was meant to introduce Governor Romney, his message. Ann Romney gave a very strong speech at the convention, Paul Ryan, and then I'll let Katie talk about that actor that came out.
Nice setup, Rich. I'm sure Katie appreciates that.
Well, I think that Rich and I were probably as surprised as a lot of you all were when we saw what transpired. And I don't think, when we were watching it all, that we were kind of watching for different things on the floor. I don't know that we were aware of, the kind of impact it was having at the time. But, Russ Schrieffer, who was one of our colleagues and who sort of executive produced the convention and was part of the conversations with Mr. Eastwood, as he says, you have this guy, this iconic celebrity that's sort of beloved by, young and old, regardless of party affiliation, offers to come and make an endorsement. It's something sort of different and entertaining. And he says he has an idea of what he's going to say. You tell him no. This was not the first time he had spoken at a campaign event. He had attended, a couple of fundraisers for our campaign and had been very much on message. And, I think, it was interesting to me to hear last week in Boston from the Obama campaign how, the impact that had in terms of sort of generating enthusiasm among their people and the fact that they felt that it was very disrespectful to the president. And, to the point made earlier that sometimes your surrogates and your super PACs, don't always do things the way you would do. One of the things we were always very cognizant of was trying to be very respectful to the president, not only because it's the right thing to do in the matter of this kind of discourse, but also because we felt like it didn't do us any favors from a polling standpoint to be disrespectful of the president. And I think maybe we didn't calculate at the time, sort of the level of antagonism that would create. But it was certainly not planned. It was nothing anybody knew. It was sort of something that came into his head, I think, when he was standing backstage and he happened to see an empty stool there. And so he had this idea of what he wanted to do. That said, I do think that the level to which the media glommed onto that and created a story out of it was, borderline ridiculous. I mean, it was certainly not the most critical thing that was said or done over the course of what ended up being a 3-day convention. But that sort of became the story of our life in 2012, was little things that were said and done that in this massive news vacuum that has been created with, nonstop, news coverage of these campaigns, that you never knew what little thing was going to just dominate. And to Erin's point of not being able to, talk about Mitt Romney as Massachusetts governor, there were all kinds of things we would have preferred to be talking about during the campaign. And we spent, I think, a whole night at the convention talking about his time as Massachusetts governor. But getting people to talk about that instead of Clint Eastwood, good luck.
Okay, let's go to the Democratic convention.
Sure. Can I say one thing about
Brent,
Yeah, absolutely.
Have Brent, Jeremy, and Marlon talk about this. You guys had a different problem. In the summertime, there was a piece that was published that President Clinton and the White House completely denied, that said that there had been a secret meeting, Clinton meeting, and that President Clinton had urged Secretary Clinton to run in the primary back, I think this was back at the end of last year or something, sometime last year. And there's been there was going into the convention kind of a rocky on and off relationship there between President Clinton and President Obama. How did you guys get that fixed? How did that transpire? And were you happy with the convention that you had?
Marlon could take that as somebody who worked for Clinton in the primary in 2008.
That's right.
I'll throw it back to you.
No, all kidding aside, I mean, I don't think the three of us are probably privy to any conversations that may have happened with the former president. But what I can tell you is, look, I mean, his speech at the convention was a great moment. Seeing him as a surrogate for us, especially in the last 2 months, was a pretty incredible thing, given, obviously, the arc of the relationship with the Clintons. He was literally, anyone who's worked with President Clinton before knows he's a voracious campaigner, and he was adding events to his own schedule. In the waning days, we'd say, let's do 5 events in Minnesota, and he would add a 6th. His advance team was a 23-year-old kid going to try to find a microphone in this new town we were going to. He did an event in New Hampshire the day before Election Day, literally from the back of a pickup truck. I mean, it was a lot of that. And so, obviously, I'll let the folks who know more than I do speak to the evolution of the relationship, but where it got, we couldn't have had a better friend or advocate than the former president. And somebody who he was able to act as a verifier and just somebody who had this unique experience of having gone through an economic downturn, having worked with Republicans in the past, having a long view on our party that really was able to say, look, give some context to what the president's been going through, what he inherited, what he's done to try to fix it. And look, I went through similar things. I was eventually successful. So even those folks that might have had doubts about how successful the president had been so far, kind of tell that story we were trying to tell of context, movement forward and eventual success. So that was helpful. And I'll let these guys talk about the convention as an organizing tool, which I think is really important and needing to talk about. But
just one point on the Clinton piece at the convention. I mean, he was the perfect spokesman at the convention. I mean, in terms of the message we were trying to drive, he drove it perfectly. And I mean, I think that Jim Margolis, who was sort of played the role of Russ, right? Yeah, from the Romney campaign. He did a great job. I mean, I think he did a very, very good job, and he worked with Andrew Bleeker on the digital side, who did a fantastic job, and Eric Smith and some others. And these things it takes a lot of people, and this is something we'll say later, but these people worked very hard and tirelessly to do this, and it was relatively error-free on our side. I mean, we had the one vote that didn't go so well. It was in the middle of the day, no one was paying attention. You guys were paying attention, but for the most part, it was pretty error-free, which is huge. But it wasn't just sort of a risk-free kind of boring affair. I mean, it was very high-powered, and we had great speakers. Julian Castro going day one, with Michelle Obama, and then you have Bill Clinton, and you've got the vice president and the president. I mean, it was just a great lineup of folks, and I think they did a very good job. And what we needed it to do was energize our folks heading into what would be the last stretch of this marathon we had been running, and it did just that. I mean, it really motivated and energized our base. At the same time, we were able to have a message that was good for independent voters and didn't sort of alienate anybody. So I think they did exactly what we wanted to do. You can talk a little bit about the organization piece, and then I want to talk about the weather.
Yeah. Well, before we go to organization, just on the message side, a couple of quick points. One is we got a lot of questions by a lot of reporters going into convention about, well, what's your convention message? What's your convention message? And we kept trying to make the point that we don't have a convention message. Conventions are just elevating moments. So our convention message was that there is a clear choice in this election between two versions of the economy, one that's built from the middle out and the top down. Now, as much as it's hard to believe to everyone in this room who follows politics, there's a lot of people out there that don't follow politics, except for the convention, the debates.
These are the normal people, though, right here today, right?
So we saw it as a moment to really shine a spotlight on the president's message and really have this kind of, it's also one of the only really unfiltered moments you get during a campaign. So that was very important to us. And then a couple of things that we really stressed was every single speaker that spoke from that stage, and I think we were pretty disciplined in this, part of their speech was talking about why they support the president. And that could be a personal story about something he had done, a policy they supported, whatever it was. But that was very important because those are validating moments for people. People see people like them on that stage saying, this is why I'm standing with the president. So, yeah, and it was very, very important. And it worked, which was good. But I'll also tell you, conventions are incredibly unruly and hard things. They are party business. They have a life of their own. And so going back to Bird's point, one of our goals was to not step on ourselves. And that took a lot of work, and I think we did that fairly well outside of some weather issues that we had to deal with. And then I had one more point, but I think I just forgot it. Whatever it was brilliant.
Can I ask one question of
yeah,
the
sure.
audience? Was anybody here was a delegate to either national convention?
Any delegates to the conventions?
Okay.
Curious. Okay.
Oh, I did remember. So one other thing, and I'd be curious to see if you guys saw this in your research as well. In terms of work we were trying to get done, and this just wasn't at the convention, this was during that time period, we were getting a lot of feedback from voters, especially in focus groups, that neither side was providing enough details. So that was, in terms of the president's speech, but on top of our usual messaging, there was a real effort to try to put some meat on the bones, both in his speech and just in general at the convention. So that was kind of a messaging goal that we had.
Okay, Jeremy, Marlon, you guys get the last word before the break.
Perfect. I think that on the organizational building side, I think the awesome thing about campaigns is a lot about moments. And so you're taking advantage of the moment or you don't. I think some of them are unplanned. We knew you were going to pick a VP, Paul Ryan, and then we were able to, on the field side, just say, what are we quickly going to do? Okay, let's look at Wisconsin, Florida, et cetera. The convention was planned, and so we were able to take advantage of that from day one. And so, like I said earlier, that was the day we knew from an organizational building side we had to be ready in the States. We had to have built all of our neighborhood team operations. All of our staff had to be ready. We had to be ready to drive the message, et cetera. And so and almost like Bert said, also we had to be ready to take a gamble. Was everyone going to come into our organization after the convention? Were we going to get a lot of online presence, et cetera? And so we gambled that we were. So we built this big field operation. We hoped the convention was going to go very, very successful. And we knew we had to be ready to take on the incoming. We couldn't just have people sign up to do something and not be ready to get them to go volunteer and stuff like that, just have a bunch of signups. we had to be ready. So we had on convention day 4,000, a little over 4,000 convention watch parties. And that Saturday, so the convention, his speech was Thursday, that Saturday we set up as a huge day of action, which for us was the first big post Labor Day test for our organization. And it was successful. So like people signed up Thursday night and Friday, we were able to call them right back, get them signed up to a shift in their local neighborhood. And that Saturday we knocked on over 1 million doors. And it was all about being prepared for that. So we knew that was going to be a big marker for us. And so literally from a year out, we were like, how do we continue to take steps from an organizational building side to get ready for the convention? And then the message part worked brilliantly and able to funnel people in, and we were just able to grab our arms around them.
And the last thing I'll say is a little bit of an aside, but I do think it's important, especially for these guys. The weather was a huge deal. They took a 4-day convention and had to shrink it into 3 days because of the hurricane, and that is not good. You don't want that. You have something planned out, you've been spending months on it, and they had to really change, and I think that put them at a disadvantage. On our side, we wanted to, we were going to fill that stadium. And I've never been more confident of any numbers in my life than we were going to fill that stadium, and it was going to be a huge, in terms of we want to have enthusiasm, we had been working for months to plan ourselves in North Carolina to have a full stadium. And towards the end, I was worried that we might have overshot the runway in terms of how many people we had gotten tickets to and confirmed. And that was a good process for us, and it sort of made us stronger anyway because we were talking to those folks and having volunteer. But it was a huge missed opportunity for us. We could have had a football stadium full of folks launching the president into the last stage of the campaign, and instead we were inside with party delegates, which isn't what we planned for. We had been planning something different for 2 years, and so that really was hard for us, particularly in North Carolina, and just sort of all the people, the staff, the volunteers that had sort of built up for that moment. They got to go to a watch party at the convention center or somewhere near, but that was very different than being in a football stadium, and sort of launching him. And it would have been a great story about enthusiasm. It would have been a big moment for us. I think we dealt with it fine, and no one really talked about it, except for internally. It was tough.
Well, it would have been a big organizing moment just in the state of North Carolina. I mean, we've always tried to approach any of our public events as not, that a person leaves there and they've been hopefully actuated to go do something. So, and we missed out on getting 90,000 people to hopefully go do some stuff.
And it just generated questions of like, can he not fill the stadium, which played into the whole enthusiasm gap thing, which Bert and I were on the ground. We're like, no, we're going to fill the stadium. And so that was just a little bit disappointing, but ultimately.
Okay, I have 5 till 5. We're going to take a 15-minute break. We'll be restarting here promptly at 5:10.